Hi, everyone. This is chapter 5. We're finally getting into our first age group of infancy and toddlerhood, so we will cover physical development. Okay, so just some basics about growth during the first 2 years. I have a male and a female, Andy and Amy, here for us to compare. And as you can see, the pictures are pretty much spot on in terms of their ages. And their development is pretty similar. We notice that it's after these first 2 years, and specifically as they get closer and closer to puberty, that girls and boys tend to have that difference in terms of height and weight and overall growth. So, sleep patterns. Our little babies typically move to an adult like pattern during the first year, again, through practice and through necessity of the parents. So, when they're first born, they need about 18 hours of sleep a day. And by the time they reach age 2, they still need about 12 hours. So, if your child is 2 years old and sleeping about 10 hours a night, they could take a 2-hour nap, right? That kind of takes care of that whole 12 hours. Night waking. So sometimes children will sleep very well, whether it's with the parent or in their own bedroom. But all of a sudden, a year and a half, 2 years old, they might start coming in, waking up. And that's due to brain development. Things are going on in the brain and kind of spark movement, right, in that baby's brain, which causes them to wake up. So, sleep is also affected not only by, like I said, by brain development, but the social environment. Some children are more sensitive to sound. Um, you know, I remember it being a recommendation to use the vacuum when your baby is little so they get used to the noise. Well, from experience with different babies, different noise, they have different sensitivity. Again, it's kind of a trial and error of what works for them. What about cultural variations in sleeping? So they find that co sleeping, meaning your child is sleeping with you, is the norm for about 90% of the world. Now, again, how you were raised really tends to play into this. Were you raised in a more collectivist culture where everybody kind of contributes to the family, or was it more individualistic where everyone's kind of out for themselves? Well, that's going to influence how you then raise your babies. I know dogs aren't babies, but I grew up with my dog having to be outside as a young child. And so when I became a dog parent, my dogs are inside. I made that change for what was comfortable for me. So again, many parents choose co-sleeping or maybe something else depending on their own needs. It is increasing in the US. They think maybe due to more mothers breastfeeding and needing the infant close by. And I like the little pictorial here because that's many times co-sleeping with a baby, right? He finally falls asleep in this last picture here on dad's face. So, that's par for the course. Okay. So, what is influencing our early physical growth? Well, of course, your hereditary information. When I look at my two twin sons, they grew in a very similar way. They even had similar physical issues. They had a surgery that they had to have when they were about a month old, and they both needed it. So, again, that kind of tells me that's hereditary. Something's going on in their biology. But what also influences your early growth is your nutrition. So, my mom, I remember her telling me when I cried, she assumed I was always hungry. So, she was constantly feeding me and breastfeeding. And when she took me for my month checkup, the doctor was like, "Whoa, your baby has gained a lot of weight in this first month." And again, it was just due to new parenting. I'm the oldest. She doesn't hadn't had any previous experience. So, we'll talk a little bit about breast versus bottle feeding, malnutrition, and overall emotional well being. Babies who are in a stressful environment may fail to thrive due to, again, how that affects their emotional well being. All right, so let's start with the benefits of breastfeeding. It corrects this fat protein balance, which they believe is a contributor to obesity later on in life. It's nutritionally complete. A mother's breast milk changes as the child gets older. It starts with colostrum, which is really not really substantial because, again, it's just a brand new born baby. But as they start to grow, the breast milk starts to change. It promotes healthy growth patterns in terms of jaw and tooth development, but also in terms of overall um, physical development. They digest it better, and they actually find they have an easier transition to solid food when they've been breastfed. Now, again, not all mothers can breastfeed. That's not a possibility for everyone. I know with my a person close to me, by her third baby, she was trying to breastfeed, but it just wasn't possible. And again, some mothers try, some have no problems, but from these statistics here, we can kind of see what the overall um, norms are, right? So from 2001 to 2011, a 10-year time frame, we see about 70% of mothers have tried to breastfeed, about 70 to 75%. 40% continue up to about 6 months, and 20% or so are continuing up to a year. Now, I have a friend actually who was still breastfeeding her daughter at 3 years old. So, again, it's about what's comfortable for you, if you're still able to produce breast milk, and overall, cultural practices. So, as I mentioned, sometimes, if we're gaining a lot of weight as a young baby, that might contribute later to being obese. So, what they do recommend is breastfeeding if you can for at least 6 months, avoiding foods loaded with sugar, salt, and saturated fats, not only for the breastfeeding mother, but for then when the baby is starting to be exposed to different foods. Promote physical exercise and limit TV viewing time as the child is getting older. And again, that will help with any kind of weight gain or connections to obesity. Now, lastly, I mentioned emotional well being, and I feel this first bullet is extremely important, and I like to read it out loud. Affection is as vital as food for healthy physical growth. So we know we need food for healthy physical growth. Food and water is a necessity. But here they're saying affection is as vital as food. Affection is as necessary, as important as food for a growing baby. So, what they find is babies who do not get attention or do not develop attachment with caregivers can be withdrawn, apathetic, um, have later cognitive and emotional difficulties. So again, it just, and they've done a lot of research on children who are in orphanages who just don't have those early connections the way, typical developing children do. And it affects them. I knew a child who had experienced some type of abuse at 4 years old. And by the time he was 6, 7, he was still had the physical appearance of a 4-year old. It was like he again had failure to thrive. So it just shows you again how important emotional well-being is. And think about that now as an adult, right? And we talk about self-care. It's really important. Your whole life can kind of shut down if emotionally you're not doing well. Same with young babies. So, in terms of physical development, we also want to talk about motor development. So, gross motor and fine motor are typically what you hear in terms of motor development. Gross meaning large, meaning the larger muscles of the body. So, things like being able to crawl with our leg muscles, stand and walk, right? Those are bigger kind of core muscle needs. Fine motor, and if you think of fine like small, are typically with our hands, like reaching and grasping. And children again go through a progression in their abilities, such as reaching. So, first, as a newborn, we start pre reaching. It's a reflex and we're born with it. Then we do the ulnar grasp, where anything we grab, we kind of reach our the tips of our fingers to our palm. By about 4 to 5 months, we can take an object and actually move it from hand to hand. And by about 9 months, we've got the pincer grasp down, which is the thumb and the pointer finger being able to pick up items. And again, that really helps with practice through um, transition to foods and, things like Cheerios that little babies will start to eat typically at around 6 months. Toilet training or toilet learning, as we can now refer to it also, they say is typically best delayed until following the second birthday. Again, every child is different. Some show um, the ability early on, and some children are really resistant. I remember being a young parent and hearing the age of 3 again being kind of the tipping point. If they aren't potty trained by 3, they're going to have difficulties. And both my sons were potty trained like a month before they were 3. But again, I seeing my friends raising their babies and my nephews, it is very um it depends on the family, the parents, the child, and what is best for that child. Well, what they find to be the most effective is establishing regular routines. Get up in the morning, use the restroom. Have breakfast, use the restroom. Go outside, use the restroom. Have a snack, use the restroom. Right? Have this routine start where the child just knows, oh, it's time to go. Use gentle encouragement. Again, many people use songs and dances and excitement when the child is starting to use the toilet and praising them for their effort, even if they don't go, but they tried. They're going to have accidents, right? So we need, and we'll talk more about that as we get into Erickson and kind of how to deal with children in this first initial stage. Okay, so the second part of this chapter goes into brain development. And if you recall in earlier chapters, we talked about, things being developed before we're even born. Well, that actually occurs with neurons. So we are born with 100 to 200 billion neurons, right? That's so many to really wrap your mind around. But neurons have a similar definition to chromosomes, right? Chromosomes store and transmit our genetic information, right? We scratch our arm, a chromosome starts to divide and develops new skin cells. Neurons store information and transmit that information to other neurons. Those messages are called neurotransmitters. So a neuron will pass information from one neuron to another. Okay, so here's a picture of a synapse. And synapses are really important because they are the connection between neurons. And here you can also see a lot of terms that might come up. So axon is from the receiving end of one neuron. Dendrites are the receiving end of the other neuron. The synapse is the space in between the two neurons, and neurotransmitters are the messages. I've lost my mouse here. And here they are again in more detail. The axon transmits the message, the dendrite receives the message, the synapse is the intersection, and the neurotransmitter carries the information. So I like to think of it kind of like a elbow, an elbow connecting to a hand, right? So you can see here that and here I'll show you guys. So I'm not exactly camera ready here, but if you have one neuron, and again, it's kind of like each neuron is the end of the elbow to the hand. Well, here's the end of the elbow, and here's the hand of the other neuron, right? They actually never touch, but they are passing messages from one neuron to the other through that synapse. So, the reason synapses are really important is again, they're the connection between neurons. Well, what we find is that neurons actually need stimulation in order to survive. Again, with young babies, right, we need to stimulate them through talk, through sound, through color, through different experiences. So, if we don't talk to babies, we don't sing to them, we don't play games, those connections will be lost. And they may not even need those connections as a baby. They may need them in the future, right? In childhood and adolescence. Well, what we find is automatically about 40% of our synapses are pruned. That just happens as we get older and as we mature. So it's important that we maintain as many connections as we can when we're young, because again, they're going to follow us throughout our life. Now, I really recommend watching this video on Blackboard about baby synapse connections. They did a little experiment on babies and lemurs, and it's just really interesting to see that perspective in terms of understanding synaptic pruning. So please, please, please go back to Blackboard and watch that video. Okay, and then here are some areas of the brain. Again, I'm not going to test you on this, but just so you kind of have an understanding of where are things happening, right? There's a visual area, an auditory area, an area that takes care of movement, sensation. So the brain has very important jobs and many times specific jobs. So, have you ever heard about right or left brained and wondered which one you are? Well, it's related to hemispheres and specializations. So, the left hemisphere of the brain is better at sequential, analytical, it's more of a mathematical type brain, whereas the right hemisphere is more holistic, integrative, and looked at in terms of more maybe artistic. Well, if you have a plastic cerebral cortex, many areas aren't going to only be in charge of one function. And that leads to a high capacity for learning because it's so plastic and able to be adaptable depending on what it is experiencing. So, more about brain plasticity, which is really interesting, is that they find if you have an injury to the cerebral cortex, either occurring before you're even born or in the first 6 months of life, you will have language delays, and at least until about 3.5 years old. But by five, they found that they caught up grammatically and in vocabulary. Why? Because an undamaged area of the brain had actually taken over for the damaged area and helped with the language function. Now, unfortunately, spatial skills tend to be more lateralized. So, if an area of the brain is affected spatially, you may not recover. But maybe you've heard of brain plasticity later in life, right? Where a stroke victim may be told they are never going to speak or walk again, and then that ability comes back for them. So the brain is really amazing in its ability to be plastic and flexible in terms of what it's in charge of. So as I talk about how flexible it is, it's also very inflexible in terms of certain things called sensitive and critical periods. A sensitive period is a period where development happens naturally. Children don't really even know it's occurring, and they're going to acquire that skill during that sensitive period. But let's say for some reason they missed that period, they can still acquire the skill, but now they're going to have to put in effort because it's beyond the sensitive period where it just happens naturally. The critical period is looked at as a specific timeline, again, in our brain, where if we have to acquire that skill during that time, or we're never going to be able to acquire it. So, again, the sensitive period kind of looks at attachment. You might have been born and put in an orphanage as a young baby and never really developed attachment. It doesn't mean that you can't still develop an attachment later on, but it's going to be more difficult for that child. They're going to have to put a lot of effort into it. Now, critical period, this will come out later on When we talk about language development, many believe that you need to learn a language before puberty, otherwise, you'll never learn it. So, the way that we kind of studied this and we started with animals was taking kittens and putting them into dark environments. So they took 1 month old kittens who had had 1 month of sight and then put them in a dark environment for 3 to 4 days. And what they found was that was kind of the sensitive period. They could still kind of develop their sight and had sight after 4 days, but it was degenerated. Now, if they're kept in the dark beyond 4 days, that loss of sight is permanent. So it again just shows that as a kitten, you cannot go longer than 3 to 4 days without exposure to light. Well, again, then they um, tested that on babies with cataracts, orphanized children. And so, again, this kind of shows a more descriptive. The sensitive period, like I said, bonding occurs naturally from birth to 2 years, but you can still form relationships. It's going to be harder, though, if you don't have that foundation of attachment. We need to learn a language before puberty. It's like a switch goes off, and we can't really learn that language in its entirety after puberty. Okay, so as I mentioned, babies who were born with cataracts, they were found that if they had corrective surgery within 4 to 6 months, that they would show rapid improvements in vision. And the longer we postpone that, the less complete they could recover their visual skills. So again, there's like this 4 to 6 month window where it's optimal to help babies with cataracts. Now, what about orphaned children? As you can see, 6 months again was kind of a turning point. Children who were there longer than 6 months had deterioration in terms of their IQ and their physical gains. So, just showing that, over 6 months, children start to struggle and when they don't have those attachments. All right. Thank you guys for following along, and I'll see you next chapter.